No bride deserves to be feared for a curse she never chose. The church bells echoed across Silver Hollow as if they were celebrating a wedding, but everyone standing beneath the white marble arches knew they had gathered to witness another humiliation instead. Evelyn Harper kept her eyes lowered while cold autumn wind teased the edge of her simple ivory veil, carrying whispers that had followed her for years. Some called her cursed. Others claimed the moon goddess had abandoned her before birth. Mothers quietly guided their sons away whenever Evelyn walked through the marketplace, and young wolves who once smiled at her now pretended they had never known her name. At 23 years old, she had become the bride no wolf would touch. The royal mating ceremony had already united 12 couples before the master of ceremonies finally spoke her name. Silence answered him. Every unmated alpha, beta, and omega remained perfectly still. Some glanced toward the polished floor while others exchanged uncomfortable looks, unwilling to become the next target of gossip by showing her even the smallest kindness. Evelyn had prepared herself for this moment long before sunrise. She had rehearsed her smile in the mirror, promising herself she would not cry if no one stepped forward. Even so, the emptiness surrounding her felt heavier than the stone walls of the grand cathedral. Somewhere in the crowd, someone quietly muttered that misfortune followed anyone foolish enough to claim her. Another voice insisted the kingdom would be safer if she simply disappeared into the northern wilderness where forgotten wolves lived alone. Evelyn heard every word, yet she stood with quiet dignity, refusing to let bitterness replace the gentle heart her late grandmother had worked so hard to protect. She remembered those comforting words as clearly as if they had been spoken only yesterday. True worth is never measured by the fear of others, her grandmother had always said. One day the right soul will see what frightened hearts cannot. Evelyn wanted desperately to believe those words, but faith became difficult when every hopeful season ended exactly the same way. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat before announcing that, according to ancient custom, the final opportunity had arrived. If no one accepted her hand, her name would be removed from the royal registry forever. A soft murmur rolled across the hall as attendants slowly approached with the ceremonial book. Evelyn reached trembling fingers toward the edge of her veil, ready to remove it herself before quietly leaving through the great oak doors. She refused to beg for acceptance that was never freely offered. The first tear threatened to form when an unfamiliar sound interrupted the suffocating silence. Outside the cathedral, iron-rimmed carriage wheels rolled across the cobblestone courtyard before stopping directly at the entrance. Every conversation vanished. The towering doors opened with a deep groan as crisp mountain air swept through the hall. Instead of a glorious royal procession, only a single man stepped inside. He leaned heavily upon a weathered wooden cane, his dark traveling cloak hiding most of his face beneath its hood. A jagged scar crossed one hand gripping the cane, while each measured step suggested years of pain rather than strength. Curious whispers spread from one side of the cathedral to the other. No noble crest decorated his clothing. No royal guards announced his arrival. Yet something about his calm presence made even the loudest voices hesitate. Evelyn slowly lowered her hand from her veil as the mysterious stranger stopped at the center aisle, lifted his silver-gray eyes toward her, and spoke 5 quiet words that changed the fate of everyone in the room. "I'll marry the forgotten bride." For several long heartbeats, no one moved. The words seemed too ordinary to carry the weight they suddenly placed upon the silent cathedral, yet they settled over the gathering like the first snowfall before winter. Evelyn searched the stranger's face beneath the shadow of his hood, wondering if she had imagined his quiet offer. She had spent years preparing herself for rejection, but she had never prepared for hope. The master of ceremonies blinked twice before finding his voice. "Sir, this is the royal mating ceremony. You understand the commitment you are making?" The man rested both hands upon the worn wooden cane and answered with calm certainty. "I understand completely." Murmurs spread through the marble hall. Some guests laughed nervously while others shook their heads in disbelief. An older alpha near the front folded his arms. "He cannot possibly know who she is." A richly dressed noblewoman whispered loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Perhaps he is desperate enough to marry a curse." The quiet laughter that followed echoed through the high ceiling. Evelyn lowered her eyes again, embarrassed that even this unexpected kindness had become another source of entertainment for the crowd. She stepped forward slowly until only a few feet separated her from the mysterious traveler. "You do not have to do this," she said softly. "If this is pity, I cannot accept it." The stranger looked directly into her eyes for the first time. His silver-gray gaze carried an unusual warmth, steady and unhurried, as though he had already considered every possible consequence long before entering the cathedral. "It is not pity," he replied. "No one should stand alone simply because others are afraid to know them." Those simple words settled deep within Evelyn's heart. They were spoken without grand promises, without dramatic gestures, and somehow that made them feel even more sincere. The master of ceremonies carefully opened the ancient registry once again. "State your name for the record." The hall grew quiet enough for every breath to be heard. The traveler hesitated for only a brief moment before answering. "Kieran." Nothing more. No family name. No title. No house. Just a single name carried across the silent room. Confused whispers immediately returned. Every noble family in the kingdom proudly announced generations of lineage, yet this man offered none. One of the royal advisors frowned. "Your surname, sir?" Kieran gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "My name will be enough." The advisor looked offended, but the ceremony allowed no rule requiring additional explanation. After a long pause, he reluctantly nodded for the record keeper to continue. Evelyn could feel dozens of curious eyes following every movement she made. She expected Kieran to reconsider before the vows began. She expected him to notice the fearful expression surrounding her and quietly walk away like everyone else had. Instead, he extended one weathered hand toward her with remarkable patience, never rushing, never demanding. She hesitated only a second before placing her trembling fingers into his. His hand was warm despite the cold air drifting through the cathedral doors. There was no strange surge of magic, no dramatic flash of light, only a quiet feeling of safety she had not experienced in many years. Across the hall, several nobles exchanged suspicious glances. A captain of the royal guard narrowed his eyes as if he recognized something about the stranger's posture but could not explain why. Near the entrance, two servants suddenly lowered their heads with unexpected respect the instant Kieran turned slightly toward them. The gesture lasted less than a second before they quickly returned to their duties, unnoticed by nearly everyone except an elderly woman watching from the back pew. She smiled to herself, as though an old story she had almost forgotten was finally beginning exactly as it was always meant to. By sunset the ceremony had ended, yet the whispers refused to fade. Every carriage leaving Silver Hollow carried another version of the same unbelievable story. The cursed bride had found a husband, but no one seemed interested in celebrating the marriage. They only wanted to understand the mysterious stranger who had appeared without family, without title, and without fear. Evelyn sat quietly beside Kieran inside the modest black carriage as the kingdom slowly disappeared behind them. Neither of them spoke for the first several miles. The steady rhythm of the horses and the soft creaking of wooden wheels filled the silence instead. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, wondering how two complete strangers could suddenly become husband and wife before an entire kingdom. Finally, she gathered enough courage to glance toward him. Kieran rested both hands upon his cane, staring through the carriage window at the endless pine forest stretching beneath the golden evening sky. His face looked thoughtful rather than troubled, as though he carried responsibilities far heavier than the worn traveling bag resting beside him. "May I ask you something?" Evelyn said carefully. He turned toward her with the same calm expression she remembered from the cathedral. "You may ask anything." She hesitated before speaking. "Why did you choose me?" For a brief moment, his silver-gray eyes softened. "Because everyone else decided who you were without ever speaking to you." Evelyn searched his face for signs of dishonesty but found none. "That cannot be the only reason." A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Perhaps not. But it is enough for today. His answer created even more questions, yet there was no arrogance behind it. He simply sounded like someone protecting a truth that was not ready to be shared. The carriage continued north until the paved royal roads gave way to quiet mountain trails lined with towering evergreens. Nearly 6 hours passed before they reached a secluded stone estate overlooking a crystal lake. It was not the magnificent palace Evelyn had imagined wealthy nobles might own, yet it possessed a quiet elegance hidden beneath ivy-covered walls and ancient oak trees. Warm lights glowed from several windows even though no servants waited outside to greet them. Kieran carefully stepped down first before offering his hand to help Evelyn. His movements remained slow, his weight still leaning heavily upon the weathered cane. She noticed the slight stiffness in his left leg and instinctively slowed her own pace so he would not feel rushed. Inside, the house felt surprisingly peaceful. Fresh bread rested upon the kitchen table beside a pot of warm vegetable soup that seemed to have been prepared only minutes earlier. Evelyn looked around in confusion. Did someone know we were coming? Kieran removed his cloak and carefully hung it beside the door. Good neighbors sometimes leave meals for travelers. She accepted the explanation even though something about it felt unusual. The soup was still steaming, the candles had already been lit, and the fireplace burned with perfect warmth as though someone had quietly prepared everything just before they arrived. During dinner they spoke about ordinary things instead of the ceremony. Evelyn shared stories about helping her grandmother tend herb gardens as a child, while Kieran listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that made her feel heard rather than judged. He never interrupted her, never looked impatient, and never treated her gentle nature as a weakness. As the evening grew darker, he stood slowly and reached for his cloak once more. "I need to check something outside before the night grows colder," he said. Evelyn looked toward the windows where moonlight now shimmered across the silent lake. "At this hour?" He nodded with a quiet smile. "I will not be long." She watched him disappear into the silver darkness, leaning upon his cane until the trees swallowed him from sight. Nearly an hour later, unable to sleep, Evelyn walked to the upstairs window overlooking the front path. The moon illuminated the empty courtyard below. There was no sign of Kieran returning. Then, somewhere beyond the distant pines, she heard the faint echo of wolves howling beneath the stars, followed by an eerie silence that somehow felt less frightening than it should have. Morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows, painting soft golden patterns across the wooden floor as Evelyn quietly prepared breakfast. The peaceful rhythm of ordinary life felt almost unfamiliar after years of living beneath constant judgment. She found herself smiling for the first time in months while arranging fresh berries beside warm bread. When Kieran entered the kitchen, he looked exactly as he had the previous day, leaning lightly upon his weathered cane with the same calm expression that never seemed hurried by anything around him. "You should have waited for me," he said gently after noticing the meal already prepared. Evelyn shook her head with a small smile. "I wanted to thank you for yesterday." He accepted the simple answer with a grateful nod before they shared breakfast in comfortable silence. As the days passed, a quiet routine slowly settled over the secluded estate. Evelyn tended the flower beds surrounding the house, gathered herbs near the lakeshore, and filled the empty rooms with warmth that had clearly been missing for a long time. Kieran often disappeared for several hours during the afternoon, always returning before sunset carrying firewood, supplies, or fresh produce that he claimed to have purchased from nearby villages. Yet something about those explanations never quite matched what Evelyn quietly observed. One afternoon she walked into the front garden just as a polished black carriage rolled away from the estate. It carried no family crest, yet its craftsmanship was finer than anything she had ever seen outside the royal capital. The driver tipped his hat respectfully toward the front door before disappearing down the winding mountain road. Curious, Evelyn stepped onto the porch just as Kieran emerged from inside. "Were we expecting visitors?" she asked. He glanced briefly toward the distant road before answering. "Someone was delivering supplies." She looked around the porch. There were no baskets, no crates, and no packages waiting to be unpacked. Before she could ask another question, Kieran quietly changed the subject by asking about the herbs growing near the lake. Later that same week, another strange moment left Evelyn even more puzzled. She had traveled into the nearby village to buy sewing thread when several uniformed riders suddenly entered the square. Their polished armor carried the silver wolf emblem reserved for the royal guard. Every merchant immediately bowed their heads as the soldiers passed. Evelyn stepped politely aside, expecting them to continue toward the village center. Instead, the captain slowed his horse the instant he noticed Kieran standing beside the bakery. For the briefest moment, the seasoned officer lowered his head with unmistakable respect before quickly correcting himself and continuing without speaking a single word. The exchange lasted no more than a heartbeat, but Evelyn noticed it clearly. "Do you know them?" she asked once the riders had disappeared. Kieran looked toward the distant mountains before answering with practiced calm. "We have crossed paths before." His answer sounded truthful, yet incomplete. That evening, while placing folded blankets inside an old cedar cabinet upstairs, Evelyn accidentally knocked over a small wooden box hidden behind neatly stacked linens. It landed softly upon the floor, its lid opening just enough for something metallic to catch the fading sunlight. She carefully lifted the object into her hands. It was an elegant silver pendant shaped like a wolf surrounded by tiny stars. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every detail carved with remarkable precision. Along the back she noticed a familiar engraving she had seen only once before, displayed above the throne during a royal festival many years earlier. It was the ancient crest of the Alpha King's household. Before she could study it any longer, gentle footsteps approached the doorway. She quickly looked up to find Kieran watching her with quiet eyes that revealed nothing. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. Finally, he walked forward, accepted the pendant from her hands with surprising care, and offered only a soft smile. "Some memories take time to explain," he said. Then he closed the wooden box once more, leaving Evelyn with more questions than answers as the evening shadows slowly gathered beyond the windows. The strange chorus faded into the snowy mountains, yet the uneasy silence it left behind lingered far longer than the sound itself. None of the visiting nobles spoke for several seconds. They simply stared at Kieran, as though trying to solve a mystery hidden in plain sight. The oldest among them finally forced a polite smile. "You defend her with admirable conviction," he said. "But conviction does not change destiny." Kieran met his gaze without the slightest trace of irritation. Sometimes destiny changes because someone finally chooses compassion instead of fear. The words were calm, almost gentle, but they carried a quiet certainty that made the air itself seem heavier. The visitors exchanged uncertain glances before mounting their horses once again. Without another insult, they turned toward the road leading back to the capital. As they disappeared beyond the snow-covered pines, Evelyn released a breath she had not realized she had been holding. "Thank you," she whispered. Kieran looked at her with a faint smile. "You never needed anyone's permission to deserve respect." His answer warmed her more than the fire waiting inside the house. That evening, thick clouds gathered above the mountains, bringing an early darkness that wrapped the estate in stillness. Evelyn placed another log into the fireplace while Kieran quietly read an old leather-bound book beside the window. Neither of them noticed the pair of riders approaching through the snow until an urgent knock echoed across the front door. Kieran rose immediately and opened it. Two men wearing the uniforms of the royal guard stood outside, their cloaks dusted with snow. The instant they saw Kieran, both lowered their heads with unmistakable respect before quickly correcting themselves as if remembering they were not supposed to be seen doing so. One stepped forward and presented a sealed envelope without saying a single unnecessary word. "A message for you, sir." Kieran accepted the letter calmly. "Thank you. You have traveled a long way. Please warm yourselves before returning." The younger guard looked as though he wanted to protest, but the older one gently touched his arm. "We appreciate your kindness." Moments later they departed as quietly as they had arrived. Evelyn watched from the hallway, puzzled once again by the strange mixture of formality and secrecy surrounding her husband. After the door closed, Kieran broke the royal wax seal and silently read the contents. His expression remained composed, yet she noticed the slightest shadow pass through his eyes. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his coat. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He looked toward the fire before answering. "An old responsibility is asking to be remembered." She waited for him to explain further, but he simply smiled reassuringly. The following morning, fresh snow reflected brilliant sunlight across the frozen lake. Evelyn walked outside to gather herbs that somehow continued growing beneath the protective shelter of nearby rocks. As she returned toward the house, movement near the tree line caught her attention. Standing among the pines was an enormous silver wolf. Its thick winter coat shimmered beneath the morning light, and its golden eyes rested quietly upon the estate. Fear never entered Evelyn's heart. Instead, she felt an unexpected sense of peace. The magnificent animal neither growled nor advanced. It simply watched her with remarkable intelligence before slowly lowering its head, almost like a respectful greeting. Evelyn instinctively returned the gesture with a gentle smile. "You are beautiful," she whispered. The wolf remained still for another heartbeat before disappearing silently into the forest without disturbing the untouched snow. When Evelyn entered the house moments later, she found Kieran standing by the front window, looking toward the exact place where the wolf had vanished. His weathered cane rested untouched against the wall beside him, and for the first time since she had met him, he was standing completely upright. As he realized she had entered the room, he calmly reached for the cane once more, but Evelyn had already seen enough to know that one more carefully guarded secret had quietly begun to reveal itself. At dawn, the royal procession wound its way down the mountain road, replacing the quiet solitude of the estate with the dignity of an ancient tradition. Dozens of silver banners bearing the royal wolf crest fluttered against the pale winter sky as the royal guard surrounded the carriage prepared for their king. Evelyn sat beside Kieran in thoughtful silence, still adjusting to the truth she had learned only hours before. Yet despite the polished uniforms, the ceremonial escort, and the unmistakable signs of authority surrounding him, Kieran remained exactly as he had been in the little stone house. Before the carriage began moving, he carefully adjusted the warm blanket over her knees and asked softly if she was comfortable. The gesture was so simple that it eased the last of the uncertainty in her heart. By midday the towering gates of Silver Hollow appeared once again. News of the Alpha King's return had already spread throughout the capital. Every street leading toward the royal palace overflowed with citizens eager to witness the arrival. Evelyn immediately recognized many of the same faces that had watched her stand alone during the royal mating ceremony. The whispers had returned, but this time they carried astonishment instead of mockery. The carriage stopped before the palace steps, where members of the royal council, noble families, military commanders, and respected elders stood waiting in perfect formation. As Kieran stepped onto the marble courtyard, every person present lowered their head in respectful greeting. Evelyn followed a heartbeat later, uncertain whether she truly belonged among them. Then she noticed several familiar faces standing near the front of the crowd. The same nobles who had visited the mountain estate weeks earlier now looked completely different. Their confident smiles had vanished, replaced by expressions of disbelief and quiet embarrassment. One of them slowly lowered his gaze, unable to meet Evelyn's eyes. Another removed his hat with visible humility. The silence stretching across the courtyard seemed to ask the same unspoken question. How could the forgotten bride now be standing beside the Alpha King himself? Kieran calmly climbed the palace steps before turning to face the assembled kingdom. His voice remained steady, requiring no effort to command attention. Several weeks ago, many of you watched a woman stand alone inside our cathedral while others decided her value without ever knowing her heart. No one dared interrupt him. His silver-gray eyes swept across the gathered nobles. Some believed they were protecting tradition. Others believed they were protecting status. In truth, many were simply protecting their own pride. The words were neither angry nor cruel. They were spoken with the quiet honesty of someone offering a lesson rather than a punishment. Kieran extended his hand toward Evelyn. She stepped beside him, her heart beating faster than ever before. He looked at her with unmistakable respect before addressing the kingdom once more. You believed she was fortunate because a king chose her. He paused long enough for every person present to hear the next sentence with perfect clarity. You are mistaken. A deep silence settled over the courtyard. I am the fortunate one. Many eyes widened. Even members of the royal council exchanged surprised glances. Kieran continued without raising his voice. Titles can inspire admiration. Crowns can command obedience. Power can create fear. None of those things reveal genuine character. I laid them aside because I wanted to know whether kindness still existed when there was nothing impressive left to see. Hundreds turned away. She did not. His gaze never left Evelyn. She saw dignity where others imagined shame. She offered compassion where others offered judgment. She treated a stranger with respect before she ever knew his name carried a crown. That cannot be taught by wealth or inherited through noble blood. He gently took Evelyn's hand before turning back toward the assembled crowd. No one here should believe that she was rescued by becoming my queen. The truth is much simpler. Every person who failed to recognize her worth lost the privilege of standing where I stand today. The one you overlooked became the greatest honor of my life, and that is a lesson I hope this kingdom never forgets again. Winter slowly surrendered to spring, and with the changing season the kingdom itself seemed to breathe differently. The whispers that had once followed Evelyn through crowded streets were replaced by warm smiles and respectful greetings. Children who had only known the stories told by fearful adults now waved excitedly whenever the royal carriage passed through the villages. Instead of hiding behind lowered eyes, Evelyn greeted every family with the same quiet kindness she had always carried within her heart. She never spoke about the years of rejection that had come before. She simply listened to people, visited small towns forgotten by the court, and remembered the names of those who believed no one important would ever know them. Before long, the people stopped speaking about the queen who had once been rejected. They began speaking about the queen who remembered everyone else. One evening, several months after returning to the palace, the kingdom gathered beneath the light of the full moon for the ancient festival of renewal, a celebration older than the palace itself. According to tradition, the Alpha King and his queen would stand together before the sacred moonstone at the center of the royal sanctuary and offer a promise to protect every wolf under their care. Hundreds of lanterns illuminated the gardens while silver ribbons danced gently in the spring breeze. Elders, nobles, soldiers, and ordinary families stood side by side without distinction, waiting for the ceremony to begin. Kieran and Evelyn approached the moonstone together, their hands naturally finding one another without a word. As they stepped into the circle of moonlight, something extraordinary happened. The smooth surface of the ancient stone began to glow with a soft silver radiance, brighter than anyone present had witnessed in generations. Gentle streams of light spread across the carved symbols surrounding the sanctuary before rising into the night sky like countless tiny stars. A quiet gasp swept through the crowd. The oldest priestess slowly smiled, her eyes shining with tears of joy. The moon goddess has given her blessing, she whispered. Not because a king found his queen, but because two hearts found one another without pride, fear, or deception. The sanctuary remained perfectly silent as the silver light reflected across the faces of everyone gathered there. Even those who had once doubted Evelyn now understood that the stories they had believed for so many years had never been true. She had never carried a curse. The only burden she had carried was the judgment of others. Kieran looked toward the woman standing beside him, remembering the lonely bride who had stood abandoned inside the cathedral while an entire kingdom looked away. He smiled gently, grateful that he had trusted his heart instead of appearances. Evelyn returned his smile with the same quiet warmth that had first convinced a disguised king that goodness still existed in the world. Neither of them had changed who they were after discovering the truth. They had simply revealed the people they had always been. As the ceremony came to its peaceful close, wolves throughout the surrounding mountains lifted their voices beneath the glowing moon, their distant chorus carrying across the valleys like a timeless promise. It was not a cry of conquest or power. It sounded like belonging. Like home. Years later, people would tell their children that the greatest lesson their kingdom ever learned did not begin inside a palace or upon a throne. It began with one woman who refused to let cruelty harden her heart and one king who chose to hide his crown until someone loved the man instead of the title. Together they reminded an entire generation that true strength never demands admiration, true greatness never fears humility, and the rarest destiny of all belongs to those who choose compassion when the world expects judgment. Under the endless light of the moon, where every story eventually becomes a memory, the forgotten bride and the lonely king walked forward side by side, not because fate had rescued them, but because kindness had quietly led them to each other all along.